News of the Times, Yuletide Tales from Old Britain, a Christmas special. Hello everyone, and a warm welcome and peaceful holiday to you all. Wherever you're watching from today, we hope this season brings you a touch of calm, a little joy, and perhaps even a moment to sit back with something warm in hand. Now, as you know, we spend most of our time here wandering through some rather shadowed corners of the past, the trials, the tragedies, and the darker mysteries of Victorian life. But once a year, just once, we take a gentler turn. For this holiday weekend, we've paused our usual fare to look at the past in a softer light, a look at ordinary people, at Christmases long gone, at customs, comforts, small marvels, and quiet moments that link us to those who lived before us. It is, after all, worth remembering that the people of history weren't only subjects of grim headlines. They were neighbours, families, market-goers, storytellers, and celebrators of the season, just as we are today. So today's episode is something a little different, a warm and reflective Christmas special, a brief step out of the shadows before we stride firmly back into them. Because rest assured, our return to the darker lanes of Victorian crime comes tomorrow, Monday the 29th, with another chapter of history's more unsettling side. But for now, light a candle, settle in, and join us for this momentary holiday pause, a gentle wander through the everyday past and through a Christmas remembered in quieter tones. And from all of us here at News of the Times, we wish you peace, warmth, and good company this season and for the year to come. Chronicle of the Times, Everyday Lives, Strange, Sad and Curious Tales from 1712 to 1731. A Patreon exclusive. Tonight's episode is something a little different. A quieter journey into the early 18th century, seen not through the grand events of the age, but through the briefest traces left behind by its ordinary people. In the pages of the early Georgian newspapers, among the reports of Parliament and trade, lie a few short lines about men and women whose lives would otherwise have vanished entirely. Apprentices, servants, labourers, travellers, beggars. Those who lived simply, worked hard, and were remembered only when misfortune or curiosity placed their names before the public. These fragments, sometimes tragic, sometimes strange, sometimes no more than a sentence, offer us a rare glimpse into the daily rhythms of a world lit by tallow candles and shaped by quiet endurance. So, if you're comfortable, settle yourself somewhere still, let the room grow gentle around you, and join me as we turn the fragile pages of the past and listen for the faint echoes of those who live their lives in the margins of history. This is Everyday Lives. There is a particular stillness that settles upon the records of the early 18th century. It is not the quiet of neglect, nor the silence of faded ink, but something older and more human. The hush of ordinary lives preserved in fragments. Not the grand declarations of ministers or the machinations of court, but brief notices, a paragraph, sometimes a single line, recording the small tragedies, the petty crimes, the misfortunes and the oddities that shaped the days of those who would otherwise have gone entirely unremembered. To read them is to stand at the edge of a lantern-lit street, watching shadows pass, a servant hurrying home, an apprentice in disgrace, a merchant studying losses, a sailor in drink, a mother in grief. For a moment, the centuries draw aside, the lives within step forward. These are some of their glimpses. The Perils of Daily Life, 1712 to 1731. The year 1712 opens not with triumph or pageantry, but with a scene of domestic confusion. At Cloth Fair near Smithfield, an apprentice was discovered to have taken his life, leaving no explanation behind. The report notes that he was quite under no visible circumstances of distress. The phrase hovers unsteadily as if the writer, or perhaps the community around him, did not know how to interpret sorrow without a visible cause. 2 years later, in Shoemaker Row, another apprentice ended his life by hanging. The notice is clinical, unadorned, and without commentary. Apprenticeship in those years was a harsh and often lonely passage into adulthood. The hours were long, the expectations unyielding, and yet the newspapers, bound by the conventions of the day, rarely speculated further. The boy is mentioned once, and then he vanishes from the archive. At Tadworth in Surrey, a servant girl was poisoned by a cooperess while preparing a meal, whether by accident or ignorance. The report does not say, only that she died with great torment, a phrase often repeated in the early press for deaths that followed swiftly and visibly. In another household, a maidservant fell into fits and convulsions after consuming broth that had stood in a brass pot overnight. Such hazards were commonplace in an age where the kitchen itself could be a risk. A labourer in Hertfordshire, walking home in the dark, misjudged his way and fell headlong into a chalk pit. His body was not found until morning. And so the record continues, one life extinguished after another, offered to the reader without flourish, yet revealing in its sparseness the vulnerability of those whose livelihoods place them close to fire, water, height, illness, or machinery. Crime and punishment. In March 1714, a man was committed to Newgate for the theft of a silver tankard. The item itself is listed in greater detail than the man, with chased sides bearing the mark of a griffin. Its weight, its workmanship, and the household to which it belonged. Possessions in this period were often described with greater care than the circumstances of the accused. Another thief, caught attempting to steal pewter from a public house, was placed in the stocks for 3 days. The report mentions that several neighbours brought food to him as he sat exposed, not out of sympathy, but to prevent him fainting before the time was up. Public punishment was to be endured, not mitigated. At 1719, at Bristol, a notorious burglar was seized in his bed, after having returned home with cut fingers and a torn coat. The report adds that his wife, being appraised of his late hours and ill ways, refused to answer the door to the constable until he threatened to break it with a halberd. Punishment could also reflect peculiarities of local custom. A man convicted of drunken disorder in Berkshire was sentenced to stand in the churchyard on a market day with the halter around his neck, holding a paper declaring his offence. He was to remain there until the parish clerk rang the bell thrice. There are more sombre entries. In 1727, at Northampton, a woman was executed for the murder of her newborn child. The paper notes the crowd was very large and that she died with penitence. Infanticide was tragically common. The tone of such notices is deeply restrained, as if the writer sought to respect the sadness of all parties without elaboration. Love, marriage and misery. Not all crimes were violent. Some belong to the gentler, although no less destructive realm of marital discord. A clothier of Kent, returning home unexpectedly, found his wife entertaining another man beside the hearth. The report observes that the husband, being of a peaceable disposition, did not resort to assault, but instead insisted that the man remained seated while he fetched the constable, a gesture that astonished the neighbours, who had gathered anticipating a more dramatic conclusion. Elsewhere in Hampshire, a young woman who eloped with a travelling musician was apprehended at the request of her family and returned by cart under the watch of 2 parish officers. Her father, a cooper, placed a notice stating that the musician was not to be trusted, having no steady means of employment and a habit of changing names when occasion suits. Some notices border on the tragicomic. A gentleman of Clerkenwell reported that his wife had absconded, taking with her 2 gowns, the best sheets, a silver cup, and a considerable quantity of jam. Whether she intended never to return or merely to enjoy a brief holiday in the next parish is left unresolved. Yet there are darker threads. A wife in Sussex, who had long suffered under a drunken husband, fled with her 2 children after a violent quarrel. The newspaper records it briskly, adding only that the husband expressed surprise that she should have removed so suddenly. The poor, the lost, and the overlooked. The early Georgian newspapers often paused their accounts of political affairs to record the plight of those who lived on the margins. Their notices, although brief, reveal more about the vulnerability of ordinary people than any grander narrative of state or crown could do. In 1716, a small item reported that a beggar woman was found dead in a field near St Albans, her body discovered only when a shepherd noticed a cluster of crows circling above. She had no papers, no acquaintances, and no name recorded, only her approximate age and the condition of her shoes, worn near through at the heel. The parish buried her at its own expense. More detail is preserved in the case of a wandering boy in Gloucestershire. About 9 years of age, he was found sitting beside a milestone on the London road, exhausted, faint, and claiming to remember only that his mother had gone into the river. Whether through delusion or truth, no mother was ever found, and the boy, unable to recall his surname, was taken in by a farmer who read the notice in the local paper. His fate thereafter disappears from view. Even young children left behind slight traces of themselves in the press. A notice from 1717 records that a girl supposed to be about 6 was found near Fleet Ditch, having strayed from her family. Her clothes are described in more detail than her features. The parish requested that any who recognised her make themselves known, but no follow-up appeared. There are also glimpses of the working poor who lived precariously. A labourer in Wiltshire, having earned his week's wage, fell asleep in a hayloft, and during the night a candle set too close to loose straw toppled over, and the loft was consumed in flames. The man's remains were discovered amidst the ashes. The owner of the barn, although not charged, paid for the burial and placed a short notice expressing regret. Another report from Oxfordshire describes a washerwoman who slipped while carrying a pail of heated water and was scalded so grievously that she died within hours. Her neighbours collected a small sum for her children, who were then apprenticed out at parish cost. These entries, although sparse, gesture toward the quiet, persistent struggle of those who lived without security, often without kin, and always at the mercy of accident, illness, and the severe economies of the time. Deception, imposture, and public unmasking. In an age that prized order and conformity, deception drew the attention of both authorities and readers. The simplest feints, pretending to be mute, blind, or injured, could lead to unexpected encounters with public's scepticism. A notice from 1723 tells of a man who travelled through London streets claiming to be dumb, communicating by gesture and chalked letters. Suspicions grew amongst carters, who noticed that, although he professed silence, he seemed to understand spoken directions with unusual speed. One afternoon, after he misstepped in front of a cart, the driver whipped the air to warn him, whereupon the mute found his voice and uttered a string of vigorous exclamations. He was promptly taken into custody as an impostor. Another instance from 1718 concerns a woman who feigned blindness at the market near Covent Garden. Her ruse was uncovered when she deftly avoided a puddle that another trader had accidentally splashed her toward. When questioned, she could give no account of her sudden recovery, and was marched to the roundhouse by a constable and two fishwives who had long suspected her agility exceeded her claimed infirmity. Imposture could also turn serious. A wandering soldier, declaring himself recently discharged from service in Flanders, travelled from inn to inn, collecting alms by recounting battles no one could corroborate. His downfall came when an innkeeper, having himself served under Marlborough, questioned him on the regiments present at Ramillies. The man faltered, then admitted he had never been abroad. He was committed as a vagabond. Such tales reveal the degree to which communities police their own boundaries, wary of deceit in an era where charity was meagre and suspicion at times abundant. Fire, flood, and other misfortunes. The 18th century bore a constant closeness to elemental danger. Fire, in particular, was a constant threat, and the newspapers were filled with accounts of sudden destruction. In 1719, a baker's house in Portsmouth caught fire when embers escaped the oven during the night. The entire structure, built largely of timber, was consumed within an hour. The report notes that neighbours formed a line to the nearest pump, but the flames outpaced their efforts. Only the baker's youngest daughter was rescued and carried through a small window by a sailor passing in on the street. A more unusual misfortune occurred at a mill near Derby. The miller, examining a fault in the wheel mechanism, leant too far and was pinned beneath the great turning gear when the current surged unexpectedly. His cries brought help, but he died within the day. The newspaper remarks that the mill stood idle until the coroner completed his inquest. Floods took their toll as well. A sudden rise of the Lee in Hertfordshire swept away a small footbridge in 1725, carrying with it a man and his donkey as they attempted to cross. The man was found several miles downstream. The donkey was never recovered. Storms were no gentler, and during a violent gale in 1728, a chimney stack collapsed in St Giles, killing a lodger asleep in the garret. The entry notes that the house was old and in want of repair, a familiar refrain in such tragedies. Medical curiosities and mortal frailties. The newspapers occasionally recorded incidents that seemed even to contemporary readers sublime in their strangeness or pitiful in their simplicity. In 1716 at Bishopsgate, a porter died from overheating, having attempted to carry an entire load of merchant goods in a single journey to impress his employer. The account emphasised the heat of the day and the man's overexertion beyond prudence, leaving his widow with 2 children. A surgeon in Red Lion Square reported a peculiar death, a gentleman having taken an emetic for indigestion, overexerted himself climbing the stairs shortly after and fell backwards, fracturing his skull. The notice gives detailed attention to the sequence of events, suggesting it may have been discussed widely as a cautionary tale. And there is the case of a young woman in Kent who, seized by sudden pains, drank a concoction of herbs given by a neighbour. Whether the herbs were improperly steeped or wrongly identified, the drink produced violent convulsions from which she did not recover. The neighbour, though distraught, was not charged. Public shame, punishment, and communal order. The early Georgian period was a world in which justice was as visible as it was punitive. Punishment was rarely confined to courtrooms or jails. It unfolded in market squares, churchyards, and crossroads, where the community served as both witness and deterrent. One notice, dated 1715, describes a man in Warwickshire convicted of profane swearing, a common offence in an era where moral conduct was a matter of public record. His sentence was to stand upon a stool before the parish church during the morning service, holding a placard naming his fault. The paper notes that several youths attempted to unsettle him by making faces behind the church warden's back, but his composure remained unshaken. More severe were the punishments inflicted on those accused of petty theft. In 1719, a young woman apprehended for stealing lace from a mercer's stall in Southwark was ordered to be whipped from one end of the market to the other. The newspaper records that she bore the punishment without outcry, accompanied by a constable, 2 beadles, and a crowd of curious onlookers. In Maidstone, a butcher found guilty of selling meat unwholesome and unfit for consumption was placed in the pillory with a piece of spoiled beef hung around his neck. The crowd jeered, although the reporter remarks that no violence was offered. Such punishments were intended not only to correct the offender, but to reassure the community that order, once breached, could be restored publicly. Another instance tells of a man fined for permitting gaming in his alehouse. The magistrates ordered that he stand for an hour outside his own door, holding a tankard chained to his wrist, symbolising his misuse of the establishment. According to the account, several regular patrons stood around him in sympathetic silence, although none dare approach too closely lest they appear complicit. These notices, seemingly stern and at times severe, reveal the communal nature of justice in age in which wrongdoings was considered a breach in the visible fabric of society, and rectification required the presence, even the participation, of the neighbours who shared the same square, parish, or tavern. Animals, accidents, and the unpredictable world. The natural world intruded constantly into early 18th century life, sometimes gently, others destructively. The newspapers preserved many scenes in which animals or accidents changed the course of a day with startling swiftness. In 1713, a report from Essex recounts the misfortune of a farmer attacked by his own bull while attempting to move the creature from one pasture to another. The animal, startled by a barking dog, turned upon him with such force that he was thrown into a ditch. Although rescued by two ploughboys, he succumbed to his injuries by nightfall. Another entry, more unusual, describes a horse in Berkshire that bolted during a funeral procession, overturning the hearse and injuring two pallbearers. The mourners, after tending to the wounded, reassembled to complete the burial, although the account remarks that some consternation attended the service. The newspapers also record curious moments at sea. A fisherman near Whitstable, drawing up his nets, found within them not fish, but the body of a man long missing from a nearby village. The tide had carried him far from where he was believed to have drowned. The notice adds that his family received the news with great grief, but some comfort that he was at last returned. Accidents in agricultural labour appear frequently. One such tale describes a boy in Oxfordshire tending geese who attempted to retrieve a bird caught in a hedge. He became entangled himself, and the frightened flock scattered into the lane. When a passing cart drove over two of them, the boy was unharmed but received sharp chastisement from the farmer for his carelessness. Even simple domestic tasks posed risks. A cooper's wife in Norwich, carrying cinders to the ash heap, slipped on a patch of ice and broke her arm. She is said to have remained in great pain for many weeks, but ultimately recovered. This modest notice, unremarkable at first glance, offers a glimpse into the constant hardship and endurance of labouring households. The natural world was unpredictable and at times merciless, yet these brief reports remind us of the resilience with which ordinary people faced its dangers, accepting misfortune as part of the rhythm of their days. Curious occurrences, strange incidents, and brief wonders. Not all entries in the early Georgian press are sombre. Some preserve the curious and the peculiar, moments that must have startled or amused contemporary readers. In 1717, a man walking near Holborn was said to have heard a strange rattling within his coat. Upon investigation, he discovered a hedgehog, believed to have crept into the garment while it hung outside on washing day. The creature was removed without harm to itself or the owner, although the newspaper notes that the man was much amazed. Another curious incident occurred in 1720 when a stone fell from the sky near a farm in Lincolnshire, striking the ground with such force that it left a deep impression. The paper records that some villagers believe it is a thunderbolt, while others thought it thrown by mischievous youths. No conclusion was reached, but the stone was reportedly displayed for several days in the local inn. There's also the tale of a tinker who, while crossing a field near Bath, found a purse containing several gold coins. Instead of concealing them, he delivered the purse to the nearest magistrate. The owner, a travelling merchant, later rewarded him with a crown. The newspaper commended the tinker's honesty, remarking that such integrity is seldom now observed, though such phrases were common enough to suggest otherwise. In Surrey, a woman claimed to have been awakened by a great noise in her bedroom, only to discover that a beam had fallen from the rafters, missing her by inches. The notice adds that she gave thanks with great fervour for her preservation. These small wonders, hedgehogs in coats, falling beams, falling stones, reveal a world in which the unexpected could catch hold of the imagination and earn a brief moment of preservation in print. They remind us that the early 18th century, although fraught with hardship, was also alive with the unpredictable, the humorous, and the quietly extraordinary. Voices in the margins, advertisements, pleas, and public notices. Beyond the tragedies and curiosities, the early Georgian newspapers preserved another kind of testimony, the small advertisements and personal notices that reveal the concerns of everyday life, what people bought, what they lost, what they sought, and what they feared. Some are humble. A cooper in Southwark advertises for a boy of honest disposition to apprentice under him, warning that idlers and wanderers need not apply. The phrasing suggests he has had experience of the latter. A woman in Whitechapel seeks the return of a lost shawl of flowered chintz, last seen at a public house near Ragfair. She offers a small reward and no questions asked, a phrase commonly used when the circumstances of a loss were awkward or when theft was suspected but unproven. Other notices speak to daily anxieties. A farmer in Kent reports that several sheep have strayed from his flock after a storm and requests that anyone who find them bring them to the Red Lion Inn to receive thanks. A week later, another item notes that only 2 were ever recovered. There are pleas from abandoned spouses. One husband announces that his wife has eloped from her bed and board, warning all shopkeepers not to extend her credit. Another, rarer notice is placed by a wife declaring that her husband has deserted her and taken the family's savings. She adds with careful formality that she will not be answerable for his debts. Notices concerning illness are frequent. A surgeon in Fleet Street advertises a new remedy for ague and intermittent fevers, guaranteeing relief within 3 days. A midwife offers her services to women in labour, adding that she has delivered upward of 500 without loss. The precision of the figure seems designed to inspire confidence. Even tradesmen reveal the rhythms of the age. A wig maker announces a newly supply of false curls for gentlemen of fashion, newly arrived from Holland. A seller of books offers a second-hand Bible with 2 brass clasps and somewhat worn, and a volume of sermons suitable only for the improvement of youth. These notices, small and unspectacular, breathe life into the era more gently than any great event could. They show us what mattered: apprenticeships, lost garments, livestock, marital disputes, health, and the quiet concerns that shape the days of ordinary people. The passing of seasons and the measure of a life. Running through the clippings is a constant sense of the seasons, each bringing its own hazards and consolations. Winter brings slips on ice, children lost in snow, and chimneys that catch fire when neglected soot ignites. Summer brings drownings in rivers, fevers in crowded quarters, and harvest accidents when the pace of work is at its most relentless. In spring, fitful storms topple trees across roads and frighten horses. In autumn, the days shorten too quickly and the travellers misjudge distances on unlit paths. The newspapers did not comment on these rhythms, they assumed them, for they govern the lives of all who lived within them. But taken together, the notices reveal the fragility of existence in a world where a misstep, a spark, an unlucky tide, or an unsuspected illness could alter a family's course irrevocably. And yet, woven through these accounts is resilience, the neighbour who raises the alarm, the parish that buries the unknown, the family that gathers goods lost to storm, the community that pauses to witness justice, and the farmer who takes in a wandering boy, and the innkeeper who restores a purse honestly found. These small acts, often unremarked upon, invite us to consider how many ordinary kindnesses lay beneath the daily record of hardship. Closing reflections. What the records leave behind. As we look across these 2 decades of brief notices, spanning counties and parishes, villages and cities, we find no heroes in the classical sense, no grand escapes, no noble speeches. What we find instead are fragments. A servant girl poisoned at her duties, a washerwoman scolded in her work, a child lost near a ditch, a thief caught by torn coat and coincidence, and an apprentice overwhelmed by burdens too heavy to name. These lives, however brief their appearances in the printed record, were full and real and meaningful to those who knew them. Their presence in the newspapers grants them a kind of endurance, drawing them forward across 3 centuries into our company for a moment. To read these accounts is not to pry into the past, but to stand quietly beside it, acknowledging the struggles and sorrows of people who lived without expectation of remembrance. They did not choose to be recorded here. Circumstance, sudden, mundane, or tragic, placed them in the public view. What survives is only a sliver of their existence, but even that sliver shines with humanity. As we close this collection of forgotten lives, the candlelight of the early 18th century flickers one last time across the page. The streets of London and the lanes of the countryside recede. The voices grow faint, but the people, apprentices, widows, labourers, travellers, children, merchants and beggars, and all the rest, remain with us in the quiet way of archival ghosts. For though they asked for nothing more than to be allowed their ordinary days, a few lines in the press have made them endure. And so we reach the end of these brief, fragile records, little more than a few lines each. Yet all that remains of men and women who lived, worked, suffered, hoped, and endured in the early years of the 18th century. In reading their stories, we are reminded that history is not only the realms of kings and ministers, but of apprentices, washerwomen, sailors, and innkeepers, children lost on winter roads, and weary labourers whose names survive because a single moment brought them into view. They were ordinary people, and yet there is nothing small about the lives they led. Each notice, however short, holds a world within it, a family disrupted, a community stirred, a glimpse of a life briefly illustrated before the page turns. Thank you for sharing this quiet journey with us. It's been a privilege to bring these forgotten voices once more into the light. Chronicle of the Times, Christmas by Candlelight, Small Tales from Long Ago Winters. Tonight, we gather by the soft glow of candlelight and turn the pages of winters long past, those quieter, older Decembers recorded not in grand histories, but in the small notices of the press. These tiny fragments, so no more than a sentence, tell us what mattered to ordinary people, how they celebrated, who they missed, what they feared, and what they hoped for as the year came to a close. They show us a world of generosity and hardship, of bustling markets and frost-bitten lanes, of sailors and servants, prisoners and postmen, and the many unsung souls who carried Christmas with them wherever they went. So, settle yourself somewhere warm. Let the fire crackle softly, and let us wander together through the candlelit winters of centuries past. The season of giving and going without, a Christmas gift for the poor, 1740. The first tale in our archive brings us to London in the hard winter of 1740, where frost lay thick upon the ground and the cost of bread weighed heavily on the minds of the poor. Newspapers tell us that a generous soul, a widow no less, distributed 16 stone of beef and 200 weight of bread amongst the needy families of her parish. She asked for no recognition. The paper recorded neither her name nor her circumstances, and yet her kindness was remarkable. In a decade known for food shortages and high mortality, such a gift was not simply charity, it was the difference between a cold winter and a fatal one. And so we begin our journey with her anonymous, compassionate, and quietly extraordinary. A Soldier's Christmas Reward, 1716. A few pages further on, we find a curious notice concerning a soldier stationed at St. James's Palace. For reasons left unexplained, although the tone suggests some commendable behaviour, he was presented on Christmas Day with a purse of guineas and a new suit of clothes. This was a rare honour for a guardsman. One imagined him a stiff back, startled and deeply proud, accepting his gift before the assembled officers, perhaps wondering how he would explain it to his family when next he saw them. Christmas sometimes brings unexpected fortune, even to those in uniform. A sailor saved by a Christmas tide, 1731. Sailors too appear often in the winter notices, and their Christmas tales are seldom peaceful. Storms battered the English coast that year, and on the 23rd of December a ship drove ashore near Harwich, spilling its crew into the freezing surf. Local fishermen found themselves poor and, working with patched nets, hurried into the water to save them. Several men were pulled to safety, others were lost. In such brief reports, the names of the drowned fade into the paper, but the bravery of those who ran toward danger remains. The hard winter of 1735. That same winter, snow fell early and lay thickly on the roads. One short line from the Daily Post reads, "Great numbers of the poor perish for want of sustenance. A grim sentence, but not a hopeless one, the record continues. Subscriptions raised in several parishes for their relief. This was Christmas in its truest form, a season where communities came together, a time when those with little gave to those with less. Misadventures, mix-ups and Christmas chaos. The Postman's Annual Ordeal, 1838. If there is one figure who deserves a particular mention in Christmas history, it is the postman. Long before the avalanche of modern holiday deliveries, he trudged through frost, sleet and darkness to deliver the season's letters. In December 1838, several London papers complained, with just a hint of festive indignation, that the postmen are overburdened with parcels and cards, and that deliveries might be delayed owing to the extraordinary heat of public affection this season. Public affection, it seems, was measured by the ounce. The Christmas goose that wouldn't behave, 1773. We next encounter a spirited goose who caused no end of trouble for a market porter at London Bridge. While being carried home for roasting, the goose slipped free, chased 3 children, plunged into the Thames, and was eventually rescued by a group of merry watermen who were more amused than inconvenienced. In the end, the goose survived the adventure, only to meet its festive fate the next morning. A Christmas Misunderstanding, 1744. In Norwich, a young apprentice seeking to surprise his sweetheart with a Christmas gift was discovered creeping around her employer's house in the late evening. Mistaken for a thief, he was seized, questioned, and was very nearly hauled before the magistrate before the girl herself vouched for him. The newspaper concluded dryly that the youth's intentions appear innocent, although foolish. Love and folly walk close together at Christmas. The Christmas pickpocket who chose the wrong victim, 1732. The festive season always brought crowds to the city markets, and with them those who preyed upon distraction and merriment. In December of 1732, a young pickpocket attempted to relieve a gentleman of his purse outside a Fleet Street tavern. Unfortunately for him, his chosen victim was a large and resolute butcher, well acquainted with his own strength. Before the thief had taken 2 steps, the butcher seized him by the collar, marched him bodily through the market, and deposited him before the nearest constable. The newspaper concluded with minimal sympathy, "He will not enjoy his Christmas as he expected," a polite 18th century way of saying the boy would be spending the holiday in jail. The Lost Child of Bishopsgate, 1719. In the deep winter of 1719, a little girl no more than 5 or 6 years old was found wandering alone near Bishopsgate Street, wrapped in a ragged cloak, bareheaded and half frozen. She had been searching for her mother, who had gone out early to fetch milk. The neighbours took her in, warmed her by the hearth, and sent for the parish beadle. Eventually the mother was found, distraught, breathless and frantic, and mother and child were reunited with tears on both sides. Even the newsman seemed moved, calling it a small happiness in a cold season. An unsuspected Christmas miracle, 1734. Near Windsor, a farmer's mare became trapped in a frozen ditch during a night-time storm. The horse was struggling and near collapse. The farmer, fearing for her life, called for help. A dozen neighbours came, carrying lanterns, ropes and spades, working in shifts through the bitter night, they dug a safe way for the frightened animal to be brought out alive. The paper noted that the mare, once freed, nuzzled her master as though to give thanks. It is a tiny moment, but one that carries a quiet and unmistakable Christmas spirit. The overworked innkeeper of Chichester, 1751. Travellers poured into inns across the country at Christmas, coaches delayed by snow, horses exhausted, and families cold and hungry. One innkeeper, whose establishment lay on the main coaching road through to Chichester, found himself overwhelmed by the sheer number of guests on Christmas Eve. The paper recounts at supper near 50 travellers were seated, the landlord being in a state of great agitation, calling for more wood, more ale, more blankets, and lamenting the sudden multitude thrust upon him. One imagines his wife bustling behind him, the children running trays backwards and forth, and the kitchen fire roaring. A frantic but cheerful sort of chaos, familiar to any household that finds itself suddenly full at Christmas time. A curious case of Christmas cheer gone wrong, 1787. In the city of Bath, a gentleman attempted to provide a small treat for the poor children of his parish by distributing sweetmeats on Christmas morning. Unfortunately, the children's eager rush overturned the basket, sending the sweets spilling across the pavement. Half the children fell, the other half scrambled after these scattered prizes, and several unfortunate adults were caught in the chaos. The Bath Chronicle reported no lives were lost, although the rector was much alarmed. The sweets, it seems, were entirely consumed. Prisoners, paupers, and the lonely hours of Christmastide. A Christmas sermon in Newgate, 1825. Christmas in the prisons took many forms, but in Newgate that year an unusual hush fell upon the jail as the chaplain delivered a sermon to the assembled inmates. The paper noted the prisoners appeared affected, several weeping freely. No details were given of the sermon itself, but perhaps it spoke of forgiveness or hope or the possibility of better days. In places like Newgate, where hope was often scarce, the effect was evidently profound. The Pauper's Christmas Dinner, 1833. In several London workhouses, efforts were made to provide a simple Christmas meal for the poor. That year, the parish of Marylebone served roast beef, broth, and plum pudding to several hundred men, women, and children. The notice reads with quiet pride. The poor expressed a great satisfaction. It would be a mistake to imagine this as a lavish feast, but for those who lived their days on the barest edge of survival, a warm plate on Christmas Day was a small but genuine joy. A tragic winter discovery, 1750. A shepherd near Shrewsbury, making his early morning rounds just after Christmas, discovered the body of a traveller who had collapsed in the night. The man's pockets were empty, his clothes worn thin. No papers identified him. He was simply a stranger upon the road. The parish buried him with the same rites that they would give one of their own. Such notices are quiet reminders that Christmas in centuries past was as full of loneliness as of cheer, and that the community's mercy often made the difference. The sailor who walked 40 miles in 1741. Perhaps the most touching of the winter wanderers is an unnamed sailor who, discharged from hospital but too poor to hire a coach, set out on foot to reach his home before Christmas. He walked for 2 bitter days, sleeping at inns when his money sufficed, and under hedgerows when it did not. In the final stretch, an elderly farmer brought him into his own home, fed him, and sent him on the last miles of his journey with a warm coat. The sailor, the paper assures us, arrived safely to his family. Courtship, kitchens, and Christmastide companionship. A Christmas courtship gone astray in 1778. In the market town of Bury St Edmunds, a young man named Thomas Whitby sought to impress the object of his affections with a Christmas gift of unusual charm, a small silver thimble engraved with her initials. He left it at her door with a note expecting gratitude, or at least a favourable smile. Alas, the thimble was intercepted by the girl's mother, who, believing it to be a clumsy attempt at bribery, confronted the unfortunate Thomas in the street and gave him such a tongue-lashing as made spectacle of him before half the town. The young lad apparently learned of the mix-up later and was amused rather than offended. As for Thomas, the paper merely says that he remained bashful for some days. The parlour fire that caused a panic in 1739. A bustling Christmas gathering in Holborn was interrupted when a spark from a tallow candle caught the edge of a curtain. The flame leapt upwards, guests cried out, and several people rushed to the door at once, creating a brief commotion. Fortunately, the host, a calm-minded tradesman, tore the curtain down and smothered it before any real harm was done. No one was injured, the children resumed their games, and the newspapers reassured readers that the festive spirit was soon restored. It is a small reminder that even by candlelight, Christmas could become unexpectedly lively. The Christmas pie that caused a neighbourly rift, 1743. In a London lane near Cornhill, 2 neighbouring families fell into a mild dispute over the ownership of a Christmas pie. The cook of one household had set the great pastry upon a window-sill to cool, whereupon it was lifted or borrowed by a boy from next door, who believed it had been left there for distribution amongst the poor. The error soon became clear, and the boy's mother presented herself at the door, mortified and apologetic. The pie was returned with only a small corner missing, and peace restored between the 2 households. The newspaper declared it an honest mistake on all sides, Christmas goodwill prevailing. The Christmas Sweep's Christmas Fortune, 1782. One of the more cheerful tales comes from Oxfordshire, where a chimney sweep, a boy of no more than 12, found a forgotten coin purse lodged in a chimney on Christmas Eve. He dutifully brought it to his master, who soon located the owner, a widow who had lost the purse weeks earlier. In gratitude for the boy's honesty, she presented him with a warm coat, a pair of stout boots, and a shilling for sweetmeats. The master, touched by the moment, added a holiday half-day, a real luxury for a sweep. Such small mercies were Christmas treasures. A Christmas quarrel settled by a song, 1795. At a tavern in Portsmouth, 2 sailors fell in dispute on Christmas night after one accused the other of withholding winnings from a card game. Voices rose, fists clenched, until a fiddler who had been playing in the corner struck up the tune of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. The change was immediate. The quarrel dissolved into reluctant laughter, and the men shook hands and both insisted on buying the fiddler a drink. The newspaper called it a reconciliation produced by the season, the music, and good ale. A Christmas Cradle in the Workhouse, 1832. Another tender notice tells of a baby born in a London workhouse on Christmas morning. The young mother, destitute and unmarried, had arrived the night before in great distress. The child came into the world as the parish bells rang the early service. The attending matron, moved by the timing, wrapped the infant in a quilt stitched with tiny sprigs of holly, a symbolic gesture perhaps, but one that brought comfort to the mother, who was overwhelmed and tearful. The newspaper wrote gently, "A small joy amidst a hard season." The Lantern That Saved a Life, 1728. On a dark December evening, a carter returning from the fields near Cripplegate heard a faint cry from a ditch. Investigating with his lantern, he discovered an elderly man who had slipped, fallen, and been unable to climb out. The cold was severe. The man would not have survived the night. The carter and 2 neighbours carried him home, warmed him by the fire, and sent for the parish surgeon. The man recovered and declared that the lantern's gleam was the light of heaven. The Market Boy and the Apples, 1754. At Covent Garden, a cheerful but unlucky market boy overturned a crate of apples in the Christmas crush. The fruit rolled in every direction, under skirts, beneath horses, and across the cobbles. A few mischievous lads seized the opportunity to pocket what they could, but many honest passers-by helped the boy gather them again, brushing the dust off and returning them to the crate. The boy was so relieved that he burst into tears, thanking everyone with such fervour as moved all who heard him. A Christmas Reunion on the Road, 1810. A post-chaise travelling between Oxford and Banbury encountered 2 soldiers trudging along the road, bound for their regiment and long delayed by poor weather. The gentleman inside the carriage, seeing their exhaustion, invited them to ride atop the chaise to the next coaching inn, where he insisted on paying for their supper. The simple kindness was noted approvingly in the Oxford Journal, which remarked that such charity is in the true spirits of the season. Winter's Quiet Miracles and a Season of Compassion. The Christmas Candle in the Window, 1769. In the village of Petersfield, a widow placed a single tallow candle in her window on Christmas Eve, a simple act done with remembrance of her son, who had gone to sea. A travelling pedlar, caught in a sudden snowstorm, saw the light and made his way to her door, where he was given a warm place by the fire for the night. The paper noted, the widow declared the candle had served its purpose, guiding one soul to safety. In a world without street lamps, a single candle could be a lifeline. The choir boy who lost his voice in 1784. At a church in Kent, a choir boy who had practised diligently for weeks suddenly lost his voice on Christmas morning. The poor child was devastated. Seeing his distress, the choirmaster allowed him to stand with the older boys anyway, so he might still take part in the procession. When the choir reached the final verse of Hark the Herald Angels Sing, his voice returned, clear, unwavering, and sweeter than before, according to the newspaper. A small Christmas mercy, gently observed. The Porter's Unexpected Feast, 1792. In Newcastle, a poor porter collapsed outside a merchant's house while carrying a heavy load on Christmas Eve. The merchant, seeing his exhaustion and learning he had eaten nothing that day, brought him inside. His wife insisted he join them at table, where he was served roast beef and pudding. The report ends with, the man departed with tears on his cheeks, blessing the household for their kindness. Christmas kindness was not always grand, but it could change the course of a day or a life. A lantern procession in York, 1803. A gentle tale appears from York, where children carrying lanterns walked house to house, singing the old carol, Joy to the World, and receiving apples, nuts, and small coins. One child, too shy to sing alone, was lifted onto the shoulders of an older boy so he could see over the crowd, and together they made their way through the frosty streets. The newspapers called it a scene of much innocence and pleasure. It is the kind of small, perfect detail that brings a whole century briefly back to life. The Fireside Gathering at Bristol, 1821. A Bristol paper recounts a family who invited several elderly neighbours, widows and widowers with no living kin, to join them for a Christmas supper. After the meal, the children performed recitations, and one of the guests, a man of over 70, sang a soft Devonshire lullaby he remembered from childhood. The report ends simply, there was much tenderness. That is Christmas in its gentlest form, shared light in a season of darkness. A final reflection, the heart of a long ago Christmas. Across these fragments, from wandering sailors and weary prisoners to chimney sweeps, children, widows, travellers and kindly strangers, we find one truth repeating again and again, that Christmas, no matter the century, was shaped not only by joy but by compassion, not by wealth but by mercy, not by ceremony but by human closeness. These small stories show us a season that was tender and unvarnished, full of small troubles and small miracles, the kind of miracles that happen quietly in kitchens and markets, on darkened roads, in workhouses and taverns, by hearthsides and windows lit by a single candle. They remind us that even in harder centuries people tried, in their own modest ways, to make the world gentler for a moment. And that brings us to the end of this year's News of the Times Christmas special. We hope you've enjoyed this softer wander through the past, a little nostalgia, a little candlelight, and a brief respite from the usual Victorian mayhem. We'll be back tomorrow with our regular programme of historical crime, so do make sure you're subscribed and feel free to give the episode a like, a share, or as the young people insist on calling it, a hype. Apparently it's worth 10 gold stars, so who are we to argue? If you'd like to support the channel and get early access, bonus episodes, and all sorts of extras, our Patreon is always open, and it's one of the nicest ways to keep this little historical expedition going. This has been News of the Times, and I, Robin Coles, nostalgia sympathiser, part-time curator of dusty traditions, and enthusiastic defender of the proper use of candlelight. And if you're the last one out, do be sure to blow out the candle as we bring this Christmas season to a gentle close. We'd hate to explain to history how it all went up in smoke.